Thanks very much, Bruce, for that generous introduction. It's delightful to be here and to be able to engage with such an impressive, diverse, and accomplished audience of innovators from the public sector, from civil society, and even from the private sector. The subject of today's panel is democratic innovation. Since the 19th century, the dominant model of a just and effective state has been that of a representative government populated by professional politicians and civil servants. This is an ideal that, when it's been developed and stabilized, has accomplished the objective of government by the people, in the sense that representatives must stand for popular election, and it's government for the people when it works, as we've heard, but when it delivers critical services and public goods that people need. However, the government that we have, even in the ideal, is not yet government of the people, in the sense that the political role of most individuals, most of the time, even in successful and stable democracies, is limited to the occasional and minimal role of voting for representatives. In this panel, we explore several innovations, mostly at the local scale, but a little bit at larger scale, that attempt to break through and develop forms of government and governance that are of the people. Several trends conspire to cause the public sector and civil society innovators to rethink the division between government and its citizens, and to find ways to thicken the relationship and make that relationship more continuous. I just want to highlight 4 trends and facts. The first is, in many societies, a growing lack of trust of formal government, political parties, and politicians, and the alienation of the citizens from their government. And this is manifest both in public opinion and declining participation in elections in many places, and membership in political parties. Second, as we heard this morning in the panel on accountability and transparency, many societies face a corrupt and unaccountable government, and the machinery of representative elections in those societies that are fortunate enough to have it can often be insufficient to hold government accountable and keep it from being corrupt and even predatory. The third is the lack of a state capacity to solve many of the problems that we care about. And then finally, facts number 1, 2, and 3 might create the demand or a felt need for a different kind of governance, but people might still be left with the sense that such innovation is not really possible, or that representative government by experts, is all that is indeed possible. So it's interesting that Amartya Sen, in his comments, said that one of the major contributions of organizations like BRAC was to expand the imaginative horizons. People used to think of development as something that was either led by the state or occurred in the private economy through industrialization and other kinds of processes. Organizations like BRAC, among others, show that civil society has a large role to play, but we didn't know that until it was demonstrated on the ground by innovators, practitioners who organize civil society. Similarly, it seems that democratic innovation isn't really possible until we see it in practice. And we've been fortunate in the past couple of decades to have a number of numerous, and some of them high-profile, innovations in democratic governance, such as the participatory budget in Porto Alegre, or much more recently, the Citizen Assembly in British Columbia, that expand all of our imaginative horizons and make us think that we can do better. So those are some trends that make us think that innovation in democratic governance is both important to have, but also possible. There are at least 3 important contributions that greater citizen participation can make. First, when citizens participate in government and in thinking about public issues and public problems, it can help stabilize and improve their preferences and views. In the United States, in public opinion surveys, and I'm sure this is true in other societies as well, people would want both low taxes and very high levels of services at the same time. Oftentimes you cannot have both. It's important for the people themselves, not just government or politicians, to do the hard work of figuring out what it really is that they want. What is the right balance between taxes and services, between growth and environmental protection, etc. The machinery of party politics and representative government oftentimes does not provide enough space for citizens themselves or the population to do that hard work. Second, in contexts and situations where government is unaccountable, where public policy decisions and laws are captured by some small group of insiders or well-organized, powerful interests, the introduction of thicker mechanisms of citizen participation can create accountability and pressure on the government process to do better and do better in the public good. And then finally, when citizens get involved in solving public problems, they can often bring capacities, know-how, a kind of knowledge and intelligence and perspective that the traditional machinery of public problem solving composed of government and politicians lack. And then finally, one substantial difference between the kinds of innovations that you'll hear about on this panel and experiences like BRAC are that the most successful innovations in democratic governance that we know about in the recent period occur at the local level. There is no, to my knowledge, experience of going to scale with democratic innovation of a kind of deeper citizen-involved, citizen participatory and engaged and empowered variety. And so it's as if we need to kind of look to the future and think how can the very promising, for the most part, local innovations in democratic governance contribute to a larger scale reform and improvement of democratic governance at either the national, the regional, or indeed the transnational scales. And the last presenter, Henry Tam, will have something to say about that set of questions. Now, as you're listening to the innovations, you might want to draw your attention to four kinds of questions that occur throughout and are relevant to thinking about any innovation in democratic governance. The first is, what is the concrete problem to which greater public participation or citizen deliberation is the answer? And it's my view that most of the innovations that are successful in the democratic governance arena address some felt need, some practical problem, that it's not just civic virtue or greater participation for its own sake that we're after. And so each of the experiences addresses a different set of problems, of concrete problems. Second, consider these innovations from the perspective of the potential participant rather than from the innovator or the political entrepreneur or the institutional designer. Ask yourself why somebody who lives in Minneapolis or Durban or a town or city in the UK would take the time and energy that's necessary to participate in the impressive designs that some of these people have constructed. Citizens have a lot of other better things to do than go to meetings, as probably some of you are familiar with. The quip that Oscar Wilde is supposed to have said, that the problem with socialism is that it takes too many evenings, and if you want citizens to participate, you have to answer the question of why it's worth their while to participate. And each of the innovations that we'll talk about today has a good answer to that question. Third, one of the most important kind of conundrums of any innovation in democratic engagement is the unequal participation that is likely to ensue from that. One of the only maybe hard and fast empirical findings of political science is that people who are better off participate more in politics. The more educated, the more wealthy, the higher status people vote more, give money more, participate in political parties and campaigns, meet more than people who lack those advantages. And ask yourself, have these innovations managed to overcome the problem of inequality? And finally, this is very important, many of the people in this room have thought a lot about innovation, the logic of innovation, and how to be creative and solve problems on the ground creatively and effectively and sustainably. These democratic innovations all do that, but they come face to face, as many of you have as well, with a very different logic, the logic of politics, which is oftentimes contrary to the logic of innovation. And think about, in these examples, how the logic of politics either reinforces innovation or seeks to suffocate it. And so that is an important dynamic to think about in these cases. The first speaker is Robert Miller, who is director and architect of the Minneapolis Neighborhood Revitalization Program. He's what some people used to call, a couple decades ago, a kind of gorilla in the bureaucracy. That is, he works within city government and city administration to create a structure within it that liberates some resources and control for people in neighborhoods to engage at a deeper and more authentic level. And so first, let me introduce Robert Miller.
Thank you. I want to first clear up one misconception. I am not a gorilla. Let me point out the situation in Minneapolis back in 1985. In 1950, the city of Minneapolis had a population of 535,000. We are a northern city in the Midwest, and for those of you who may not have heard, we had 12 inches of snow yesterday. And I'm not going to go back and shovel it. I'm going to wait till that stuff melts. So we started off with 535,000 people in 1980. Well, in 1950. By 1980, our population had changed to 360,000. That's a drop of 32% in a little over 3 decades. The number of housing units that we had in the city of Minneapolis in 1950 was 180,000, and that's almost exactly the same number that we had in 1980. What happened? We lost population, we lost tax base, we lost businesses. There was reduced investment in public infrastructure. We had increasing levels of crime and poverty. At one point in time, the New York Times called us Murderapolis. We had a deteriorating housing stock to the point where in 1992, we had more boarded and vacant housing than at any point in the city's 100-year history. At that time, there was an awful lot of discussion about what can we do about this. And there were, of course, the answer that all of us come to. We form a committee. You form a committee because you've got to look for different answers. And as soon as the committee's done, you establish a task force to discuss what the committee found. And you talk about, okay, how do we go about implementing what everybody's been talking about? The change here was that in 1990, the Minnesota State Legislature decided that the situation in Minneapolis and in our other 2 large cities in the state was such that they were going to allow the cities of the first class, that's what they call the big cities, to have a neighborhood revitalization program. And they defined it in statute and gave it broad powers. And here comes the really innovative part of what happened next. With the city of Minneapolis, they turned around and said, because you decided to refinance some tax increment bonds against the will of the state in 1989, we're going to basically require you to use the funds from that refinancing and put that into the neighborhood revitalization. What does that mean in terms of that bill? It says that the bill was going to provide $20 million a year for 20 years, $400 million, strictly for neighborhood revitalization. And neighborhood revitalization, in a way, unlike any other time in our experience, because it required that neighborhoods and residents set priorities. And without a neighborhood plan, there could be no investment. This is a pretty unique process, and it's pretty unique from the extent that it ties together planning, which many jurisdictions and many organizations do, with implementation, which very few have the resources to do. So when neighborhoods started talking about how do we deal with the boarded and vacant houses, they had resources to say we are going to tear some of them down, we're going to rehab others, and we're going to get new owners. It's a change, and a major change, in the way people look at how they participate in their own government, but also what is their role in a civic society. For decades, we have seen the dropping of participation by residents and by citizens in their government. Unless that gets reversed, what are we going to do in the future? What is the legacy that we're going to leave? When we started off, it was a process that I think many people thought would be relatively simple. There were a few problems. Number one, there wasn't an organization to actually do the neighborhood revitalization program in Minneapolis. Number two, there was no idea of how the money was actually going to get to the organizations that they were going to fund. And number three, there was nobody who knew what a plan was. So let me point out to you that as you look at processes like this, where we have true innovations, you start off with an education process, and most of us don't really realize how important that is. When I came to this program, we were just getting started. And the very first thing I said was, okay, let's develop a plan. So the first neighborhood came in with their plan, and it was going to spend $35 million, of which we couldn't give them that much, but nobody had thought about that question either. So we hadn't thought about some of these basic things. And I said, well, why does this plan look this way? And nobody could tell me. And so we sat down and said, what will a plan look like? And then, how are we going to teach people how to do that? Because if you think that developing a plan is a natural course of human events, it doesn't happen that way. So we sat down and we decided a plan was going to contain 4 components. A vision statement saying what the neighborhood wanted to be looking like in 10 years. What did it see itself as being? Not tied to the constraints of today, but what did it want to be tomorrow? And then the goals and objectives that would help them to reach that vision. And then the very specific things of the strategies and the specific actions that would take them step by step to achieve those objectives, to achieve those goals, and to achieve that vision. And that's what neighborhoods have done. I think the most impressive thing from this program has actually been the results. When we started off, about 40 of the neighborhoods of Minneapolis were actually organized. They covered about 63% of the population. Every single neighborhood in the city is organized now, and we have 100% of the population covered. We have invested close to $280 million in the revitalization of neighborhoods in the city. And every neighborhood in the city participates, not all at the same level, but every neighborhood has something. And because of that, we have realized over $1 billion of public and private matching leverage. That means change, and it means big change. But the biggest change in this program, and it's the one which I feel is the most important, is that we have moved from a system in which there was participation or involvement to a system in which there is empowerment. And I mean true empowerment. The ability to help make decisions that matter. And that makes a difference to people who are coming in there who are saying, why should I be involved? The very question that Archon raised. Why is it that somebody should care? In NRP, they not only have an opportunity to invest in their neighborhood, but they help make those choices and decisions. I encourage all of you to pick up some of those copies of materials out there because, frankly, I'm not going to carry those things back. And there's a lot of good information out there. Thank you, thank you. And I want to say, I didn't see a whole lot of those home tour guides going, but you guys are missing a great opportunity. You got to read that stuff. That's a program that these neighborhoods have started, and it's a brilliant way of teaching people about what the benefits of living in a city are. And I also make money at it. Now, I want to close with a statement by a relatively famous person from right around here. Yesterday I was down at Faneuil Hall, and I was struck by a quote that was in the concrete. And it is not by one of the founding fathers, so you don't have to worry about that. What it was by is a guy who obviously had extraordinarily big feet, because I swear they were this concrete prints were this big. And it's from the inaugural address of Kevin White, who was the mayor of Boston for a good period of time. And I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm going to make a change because I'm from Minneapolis, he's from Boston. I don't care what Boston was thinking about this, but I do care about it from Minneapolis. And here's what he said. We can erect thousands of buildings and put down miles of concrete, but unless we can say that You can fill in Boston, Minneapolis, any other city that you want, any other city that you want. Unless you can say that that city is a better place to live, we will have done nothing. And I hope that you will see the approach that we're taking as a way of trying to get to doing something. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. The next speaker is Richard Dobson.
I don't know how to respond to the fact that I've been an architect for decades, but I'll just try and let that one go past. I think before I start, I do feel the responsibility to give just a little bit of context and a little bit of background, so don't feel humiliated by my geography lesson. But within South Africa, Durban is a port city, one of the three biggest metropoles. Because it's a port city, it's obviously a gateway, and quite literally a gateway into the tip of Africa. Within the South African context, probably a relatively small city, 3 million people, but the idiosyncrasy of apartheid is that because of our racial segregation, the core part of the city only has something like between 60, maximum 100,000 residents in the core part of the central part of the city. The rest live in peripheral areas. What is also a characteristic of the city, and we are now thankfully starting to move out of it, is what loosely became known as white flight. That was really part of what internationally would have been an urban regeneration cycle that was starting to blight cities, but obviously a racial component started to creep into South African cities, where particularly white property owners were voting with their feet and actually relocating to the edges of the city in suburbia and building their commercial and business offices in those areas. So the Warwick Junction project grew out of that, an inner city urban regeneration program that really in many respects inherited mass under urban management. In other words, there were issues that were really not receiving local government attention, right down to basic services. But also the node was the public transport node, also an apartheid legacy in the sense that black people had to access the city from a particular public transport interchange. And because it was black, it was also, again, underserviced. So really you see a white, so-called white part of the city, the black part of the city, highly underserviced, and that was the target area in 1995. So we've just come out of apartheid into a new dispensation, and this was the energy that was being brought. If I talk about under urban management, it's probably a bit of a euphemism of the kind of activities that we are seeing. If I was to show you slides, I think certainly the vegetarians probably might start to leave the room. We're talking about the cooking of cow's heads. We are talking about a traditional herb medicine market, something like 1,000 stallholders. Excuse the numbers here, but I have to translate into dollars. Annual turnover of something like $35 million a year in the sale of medicines. 14,000 people employed outside of the market. In other words, that's the employment chain that's dependent on that site in the inner city. Could also talk about the cooking of corn on the cob. Corn on the cob is cooked in 200-liter drums, 13 dozen mealies at a time, with wood fires that boil the drum at about 120 degrees Celsius. But each day in the height of the season, we're cooking between 26 and 28 tons of mealies a day. Mealies back home, corn on the cob. Street value of over $200,000 a week. These are the activities that are happening on public spaces, on the streets, wrecking the pavements, blocking the stormwater drains, and just really adding to the chaos that I previously described. Our task was to come in and start to obviously regenerate that. Any regeneration program has to use, in my opinion, the latent energy that's within that area. So clearly, public transport node, clearly the feet that were depending on that public transport were relying, and it was the informal economy, traders in public spaces eking out an inner city livelihood. I was asked to try and capture what the innovation was. And I think it's dangerous to try and put names to this, and I've got a very poor one. But I tried to describe what we did as communalizing the project. And I think one of the most important aspects of any work we do in a development mode is that we've got to make the process clear to everybody. I think we either choose not to communicate it because we want to manipulate it and to use the power that we have within ourselves as practitioners, but I think we forget that communities need to know how they can fit into a process and where they need to participate at what time. So I think there were 4 basic pillars that upheld that approach. The first is what I've called collective learning. I've described the informal economy, I've described the activities that were there. Not only were they activities that the community were engaged in, they were unfamiliar, they had a measure of urban illiteracy from that activity, but also the project team that came in. No one had designed a herb market, no one had designed a market for cooking cow's heads, equally corn on the cob. So there was almost an automatic meeting of everybody in the sense that we needed to learn from each other if we were going to move forward. I think that was important in terms of us really starting to need to identify what the process was going to be in doing that. Secondly, consultation. We'll all laud ourselves that we've actually consulted, but I think in this instance what we're looking at is that we're coming out of apartheid. Apartheid was notorious for not consulting a particular sector of the population. So urban illiteracy was paramount. So you're approaching people who aren't used to being approached for an opinion, participation, etc., etc. So years that we had to catch up from that point of view. But we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about language, and we're talking, well, patriarchy, we're talking gender. So we had to deal with all those. And I think for us, what was really encouraging is that, given my first point, the need that we had to talk to each other from a learning point of view, that started to mature into a connectedness where we were able to start to move forward and find each other. The third was that because we were under-resourced, we had to engage in a developmental approach. We had to say, what are the maximum number of resources we can actually bring to this situation? So clearly it was human, in terms of what local government could bring, in terms of its team, and then it also had to be material. In this instance, it was how we could use the public spaces creatively. From a human point of view, the city chose to move its development team into an abandoned warehouse that we restored, so we became area-based in terms of our administration. In terms of the public space, the city owned huge chunks of land because it was a public transport interchange, so the sidewalks and the public spaces within that area were within the control of the city, so we chose to utilize that space for the provision of infrastructure in support of the informal economy. The fourth was participative implementation. Because of the density of the area, unless we were to be collegial and work out how we were going to do this together, accepting the disruption to all parties, that's even the traders and the local authority, we were not in fact going to implement the project. So those 4 pillars, as I said, really brought a new dimension in terms of us being challenged to make the process very clear. And we're talking about a project now that's run for 10 years, and there's still people who are now very clear as to what their so-called roadmap was and where they were meant to be moving forward, and hence how they were able to find a place within that. What were some of the obstacles? Time prevents probably talking about a lot of them, but maybe 2 to highlight them. I think the first is probably around the political dimensions. One of the challenges of adopting an area-based management approach is that you run the severe risk that the project, and particularly the project center, almost becomes a decentralized city hall in terms of the politics. The local community become so accustomed to the apparent action happening very locally that you run the risk of alienating formal politics and the politicians that are around you and at a higher level. So a real responsibility from a leadership point of view to be the connection point between the political realm and the project happening at a local level, and making sure that those connections are made and managed. However, what you also have, because of the slight disconnect, is that you can have fickle involvement from politicians. and I don't mean this critically, I mean it really just as a sheer matter of fact. If you're operating locally, the politicians aren't necessarily aware of the full import and the detail of what's happening at the project, so they get involved occasionally, not necessarily appropriately, and so you cannot necessarily rely on their support to happen at the right time and also saying the right things. The second is the aspect of urban literacy. Obviously, clearly, in an underdeveloped country, you're dealing with huge migrations into cities, so you're not dealing with generations of people who understand how cities work and what the common accord and the common expectations are within a city. So it's a whole body of work that you have to deal with, not in a patronizing way. You can't assume it, but you have to assume that you need to deal with it because there are going to be people who can't cope with it. So to conclude, the project's now been running for 10 years. We believe that that shows a measure of track record, a measure of sustainability. It's respected the fact that there are inner city livelihoods that need to be provided, irrespective of whether that is your preference for that activity in a city. Many African countries, you can see from the track record, would prefer that the informal economy is not there. It really doesn't let their city, their country aspire to what they believe to be the so-called world-class city. But Warwick Junction provides these inner-city livelihoods for between 5,000 and 8,000 people, and those are livelihoods that weren't there before. Records show in South Africa at the moment that the informal economy is the only job-creating sector of the economy that's actually forming sustained jobs. So as unpopular as it is, it's still a reality that you have to face and to make provision for it. And lastly, I want to conclude by saying that my intention and my now activity in forming the NGO, which is to work within the same area, is not a comment on local government. It's rather a comment of confidence, because I have the firm belief that the community is mature to a point where the stakeholders need to be challenged now to be articulating their own projects and bringing those projects to fruition either through private funding or through a challenge to local government to make the provision for those projects to happen. Thank you.
About a month ago, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Gordon Brown, gave a remarkable speech in which he said that party politics in the United Kingdom is not going to be capable in its current incarnation of engaging whole sectors of the population that have tuned out and are disaffected by politics, and so that the structures of party politics needed to be supplemented by other forms of citizen engagement at the local level and even at the national level. And the next speaker, Henry Tam, has been working on this problem for some time. He is Deputy Director in charge of Community Empowerment Delivery at the Department for Communities and Local Government in Great Britain. He's worked for a long time on issues of local empowerment. He is also visiting professor at the Faculty of Lifelong Learning in Birkbeck, London University, and a fellow of the Institute for Globalization and Sustainable Development at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. Henry Tam.
Thank you very much. I'd like to share an example with you from the British experience. British people, as you probably know, have always been at the forefront of citizen participation and empowerment. Around 1776, I remember, a few Brits living around this part, actually, of the country, said to their king that if you don't let us have more power and more say in what happens, we would do worse than dumping tea in your harbour. Now, actually, it's very serious, because, you know, for Brits, dumping tea in the harbour is just the thought of it itself. Anyway, the king didn't listen, so the rest is, as you may say, history. Anyway, not long after that, the Brits around this part started calling themselves Americans, and started drinking coffee as well, which is another terrible thing. But be that as it may, I'd like to fast forward 200 years or so to around 1997, when the Labour Party, having been out of government for nearly 20 years, got back into government and started putting a lot of effort and priorities into investing in public services. So over the first term, from 1997 to 2001, there was huge public investment in public services, improving policing, health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there were lots of public figures which showed that crime was coming down, there were more hospital treatments being carried out, more unemployed people were helped back into jobs, and so on and so forth. And yet, by the end of their first term, they got back in for the second term, but they started to notice that a lot of people were saying that they don't actually believe that the government was doing the right kind of thing for them, that the government was setting priorities that they were concerned about. Through surveys, we found out that from 2001 to 2003, the percentage of people who thought that they could influence decisions affecting their local areas dropped from 43 to 38%, and the trend was a downward one. It also correlated with other survey findings, which suggested people were not interested in participating in public policy issues and so on and so forth, not because people were not interested, but because people consistently said they felt that they were powerless to make any difference to the process. So in 2003, the Secretary of State for the Home Affairs Department said he wanted to actually turn this round. It's not good enough for people increasingly to feel disengaged, to feel powerless in relation to the government. Something must be done. And he said he wanted a new unit to be set up, the Civil Renew Unit, and I was handed this job. Now, a lot of colleagues in different parts of government at the time, I remember fondly, were saying, good luck to him. Because it's like one of those, I don't even remember the program, Mission Impossible, when you're handed a tape to say, this mission is absolutely impossible. You'll probably die trying to accomplish it. But if you choose to accept it, because you're a lunatic, do take it on. So anyway, being a lunatic, I took it on. So how do you actually turn this round? There are some tremendous obstacles, as I'll come on to. But at the same time, it clearly can be done. I mean, from the examples that Bob and Richard and many others have been saying, there are lots and lots of really inspiring, innovative examples out there of how citizens can be engaged constructively to influence decisions, shape public outcomes for the communities. So how do you actually bridge these two things? We decided to actually take on an innovative approach in itself to do this, kind of applying social marketing principles, that we want to run a campaign to actually change culture, to change practices. And I came up with, and this is long before one of your presidential candidates decided to take it on himself, we came up with Together We Can. So the trademark is there back in 2003. And under the Together We Can banner, we branded everything Together We Can. It has three main components. The first one was developing citizens' skills. And in this, we work with lots of third sector, NGO, and education providers and public sector bodies to give citizens the skills and confidence to actually work with public sector organizations. I think it's already come up earlier today. It's so important to be able to know how to approach public sector people, because very often it's not easy. So how do you get the skills? And we developed a network called Take Part. It's still going strong, which is spreading more and more people are actually developing these skills. Many people go on a program initially said they would never even think about going to public agencies. Some of them are now standing for public officers. It's clearly making a difference. The second component is communities' capacity. We work with a lot of networks of neighborhood organizations, community organizations, to help them develop the strength and share good practices. One particular initiative was a Guide Neighborhoods initiative, where we bring neighborhoods which have successfully asserted themselves, have got more influence over public decisions, and get them to share the experiences with other neighborhoods. Because again, through research, we found out that neighborhoods learn much more effectively and quickly from other neighborhoods than they learn from consultants, and it's a lot cheaper as well. No offense to consultants in this audience. And the third component is partnership with public bodies. We know that even if citizens have more skills and more confidence, communities have the capacities and so on, unless public sector organizations at the national, the regional and the state and the local level really are ready to respond and embrace people and give them a share in decision making, it wouldn't happen. So we actually work with government officials and politicians at all levels to share good practices is almost becoming a mini industry of how to capture good practice, bottle it, and then distribute it out to different points across the country. I'll just cover a number of the obstacles we had to overcome. Firstly, the tremendous political commitment from my own ministers, and it wouldn't have happened without them, was not necessarily and thoroughly shared by the Secretary of State and ministers of other government departments. They had their other priorities, and it was a job to actually convince them. But what we did was persisting in bombarding them through our Secretary of State with success examples, success stories. And you can never have too many success stories. We had examples like in one area on crime reduction through neighborhood engagement. Not only did crime come down, but the confidence rate that local people had in the local authorities and in the police went from about 20% or so to over 80%. Now, these figures, they can't ignore. It's tremendous. You can't buy the kind of change in public perception. We have found out that tenant management organizations, where tenants actually had a say in how housing services were managed and delivered, had overall higher rates of satisfaction than housing services still managed by public sector organizations without tenant involvement. Another obstacle was the lack of coordination, which we put in through our campaign so that both at the local level and at central government level, people would regularly work together. A third obstacle I just mentioned is the confusion with volunteering, because when you use the term citizen engagement in some circles, that is interpreted as getting people to do voluntary work, which is a very good thing in itself, but it's no substitute for actual citizen empowerment. So we actually had to make it very clear that when we measure people's performance and success, we will not talk about the number of people they've got to do voluntary work. It's actually what power has been shifted, what influence people feel they've got. And fourthly, there is public skepticism, because there's a lot of very bad consultation practices going on out there. I'm sure that you find the same in your areas. People send out some completely ludicrous documents and ask people to say, could you let us have your comments? And then people try to write something back and then it's totally ignored. That's not engagement, that's not empowerment. And we have to constantly explain why those practices would not work and why good practices need to be put in instead. Well, where are we now? Basically, we are quite a way ahead of schedule. We have now got all the secretaries of state in the cabinet signed up to the Together We Can campaign. In fact, even some whom we left out initially because we thought, well, it's not really that immediately relevant to them, like the Ministry of Defense, they've come back and say, no, we actually want to be involved. So that's encouraging. We've introduced a statutory duty to involve, so that every local authority has now got a statutory duty to involve their local constituents in decision making. We're accelerating the program of adopting good practices. Lots of innovations which are mentioned, Archon, you mentioned participatory budgeting. We now have an ambition of getting every local authority in the country to adopt and apply participatory budgeting practices. And just one example. The decline in the rate of influence people feel have over the local area has, fingers crossed, seemed to have come to a standstill at the moment. And that, of course, in itself is still not enough. We've adopted, as a government, a public service agreement target to actually improve that across the country. I have the responsibility of making sure that that particular target is delivered. So that is, again, a challenge and a half. But what I have learned from our own experience is that when people say that empowering citizens for them to work in real partnership with government is really, really difficult, is really impossible, what I would say is that actually maybe I individually can't do it, you individually can't do it, but together we definitely can. Thank you.
That's fantastic. And even more fantastic, or as fantastic, is the incredible discipline of the panelists, which leaves us some time for questions.
My name is Anwar Shah. I am with the World Bank Institute. And Dr. Fung argued that democratic processes do not always lead to government by the people. I like to carry this idea further, going to the ancient Greece. Some lessons one can draw from their history, because Greece was the cradle of Western civilization as well as the birthplace of democracy. Now, Greeks believed in two things. They believed in people empowerment, and they believed in God. So they wanted a method of government by which they could empower people, at the same time empower God. So the method of government they chose was, this is their first experiment in democracy, they chose was, they will draft elected officials by lottery. Nobody would run for any election. People will be drafted simply by lottery, and then they required the oath of office, which stated that we will leave the city and the government, country, better and more beautiful than when we assumed office. So there was a compulsory oath of office. There was representative democracy by this. This was empowering people, because lotteries tend to go towards the average selection of average citizens. This was empowering God, because lotteries is an act of God. Who knows whose name will be picked up? So the question is, can't we have this eliminated the professional politician altogether? Now the question is, can't we experiment this idea at least a small scale in a city government to see whether this will work? And this idea is much more important for modern times with the information revolution, which allows us to select citizens and be drafted into public office. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, there are actually several experiments in government by lot, not quite along the Greek model, but one important one occurs in the British province of British Columbia. And there they were faced with making a decision about how to move from majority rule to some sort of proportional representation. And in every country and all the states in the United States, usually this is done by elected politicians, right? But what happens when you let elected politicians make the rules of how they will get elected? They make rules that maximize their own chances of getting elected. Fairly straightforward. So in British Columbia, they decided to convene a body of 170 citizens randomly selected by lot out from the whole province. And these citizens met for a year, and they deliberated, and they eventually recommended a system of proportional representation that bypassed the legislature and went straight to a referendum of the entire province. And it secured 58% of the popular vote. But the rule was that it needed 60% to pass, so it just failed. Now the sitting government is in this odd position of having been elected under a set of rules that the majority wants to go, so they're going to have another election in a year and see if there's a more decisive result.
Thank you, Mr. Robert Miller. He said the Minneapolis is a disaster, and so the government allowed to revitalize the local communities. But if there is no disaster, how will you reconcile? Because when you are empowering the local bodies, basically you are the central government or bureaucracy. They would be losing some of their authority and power, including the politicians. Under such a situation, how will you reconcile it? And what will help in improving the, empowering the local bodies and to encourage their potential, fullest utilization of their potential, as you did in case of, as you did in case of England? How will you reconcile this division? I mean, this power struggle between the bureaucrats and the political leadership and the local, power brokers. So how will you do it?
I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the things that we have to get to is a different understanding of power. Because one of the things that we've experienced over the years has been the more power that you give up, the more you actually end up having. Because as you share it and more people get involved in it, it broadens the amount of resources that you can bring to the table. It broadens the capacity for you to accomplish some of the goals that you've got. But that does take a different perspective as to what it is that you're trying to achieve. You've got to look at the long run. One of the issues for most politicians is the fact that they're looking at 2 or 4 years or 6 years, and there's a very short time span. I don't think this is going to occur very easily. To give you an example, I've got 4 council members that are on a committee looking at the future of the program that I'm in. And their first comments to me were to tell me that all of them came out of their neighborhood organizations. And their very first actions were to try to eliminate them. There is no question that people can recognize the weakness of giving other people potential power or giving up control. I think the best thing that you can do is to look at the results that you achieve by doing it on a small enough scale so that it isn't threatening in the beginning, and then building it from there. You've got to prove that you can accomplish something. You've got to prove that you can do things that people support. You've got to get the support of the people themselves, and then you can start to change some of that long-term perspective. You're not going to do it easily.
Anybody else?
Can I just say that one of the things to get people with power to be prepared to share that power out is to get them to see that they are actually better off, that they can achieve things that they cannot achieve on their own. For example, there have been many cases where people in government had found that they cannot get people to be convinced that they are reducing crime, or they're making their communities safer. In many of these areas, precisely, they're actually far from disaster areas. They're actually quite reasonable areas, quite safe areas, but people just do not believe. They feel they're disengaged from the government, and people in government now are accepting that they must turn it around. There are also many difficult, very difficult decisions that government has to make. One of the recent policies, and I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that successfully developed, is that the disposal of nuclear waste has now adopted a citizen engagement approach to it. Now, 2 decades ago, you would say that these are top secret security issues. The last thing you want to talk to citizens about is something like disposal of nuclear waste. This is only something government officials secretly would huddle up together to decide. Now they realize that you can't actually get a sustainable policies unless you actually work with communities and citizens.
In the blue right there?
My name is Mary Casey from Northern Ireland. I'm chairwoman of a neighbourhood village area forum, which has initiated links, cross-border links, with another jurisdiction. I'm also a member of the executive committee of a Northwest Community Network, which is an umbrella organisation for some 500 community groups in the cross-border Northwest region of Ireland. And this very issue of citizens' engagement and community engagement is on our agenda at the moment. It's on our table now. Government, on its white paper at the end of this year, wants to empower communities. But through its past record of citizens' engagement processes and consultation, it has really not tapped into mechanisms that encourage engagement in terms of the language that's used, in terms of the vehicles, in terms of the places for consultation that are used, in terms of being comfortable for communities to give their say on issues. I'm just wondering then what the UK government, the British government, and what the government therefore in Northern Ireland will be doing in terms of opening up spaces, places, education, and cultural awareness of citizens' engagement.
As I said, one of the key strands of our work is to develop citizenship skills in engaging, but equally important is for government bodies, officials, to learn how to engage more effectively. And I would agree with you that a lot of the consultation and engagement work that's been done up to now is not good enough, and much more needs to be done to make it more sophisticated, make it more user-friendly, and I think a lot more work needs to be done in the area. And we are engaging more and more actually with civil society partners to actually take on board a lot of their network, because sometimes it's much better and more effective to use the networks which exist out there than for government to actually create artificial networks of consultation, which actually don't tend to work as well.
I'm sorry we're running out of time, so this will have to be the last question. But there will be more time to discuss this in the small group sessions.
Daniel Holmesy with the City and County of San Francisco, and I just want to commend Dr. Tam on the work you're doing with the British government. I think having that level of ownership at the federal level would be a really great thing here in America, and perhaps President Gore will be able to implement it. So my question is this, is that we're implementing a very similar model in San Francisco. It's called the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, and it's fantastic to hear the work you've done already, because I hope to leverage it all when I get back in the budget process to get money for it. The bottom line is this: an initiative like this has so many masters, and one of the things that we found is the neighborhoods really embrace it because they all want better control of what's going on, the narrative between them and City Hall. The hard part often is to get the stakeholders inside City Hall to buy into it. And you've done a lot of research, obviously, about the benefits that have been extended out in the neighborhood. But have you done any studies within the construct of the culture of the people that own the ministries and manage the programs to show that this actually helps them have better partners to deliver their programming and have higher results on the programming and better investment of tax dollars in the return, so that they'll be more likely to comply and participate in the future?
Yeah. We have started to do that, probably, again, not as much as I would like it to be. I mean, one particular program, we found that it was a fairly localized project, but it involved one fairly large city council, that their support to the tune of about £600,000 for a neighborhood-led project actually generated savings of over £6 million. And that was very effective in persuading the city council to actually roll out that program across their city. We had difficulties, we're still trying to fathom out exactly why in getting other cities to adopt it. So maybe the learning needs to be not just within particular cities, but actually cross cities as well.
All right. I'm afraid that that's all the time we have. I know that there are a lot of questions. I apologize, and let's give a big hand to the panel. Thank you.